let's talk about ways, Commissioner, that you think things are working and how we can, improve or build upon some of the successes that we're seeing at the state and federal cooperation.
Great, sounds good. Well, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks everyone for being here. It sounds like the program has been fantastic so far today. I was joking with my colleague Dave Rosner that he took all the good materials, so I'm sorry that you all have to hear from me second. We need to arrange that I get to go first ahead of him going forward. But it's great to be able to talk a little bit about state-federal cooperation. I always think it's really interesting when I'm asked this question because for the better part of the last 7 years I was on the state side. I was working in West Virginia, and I've only been on the federal side for the last 9 months. And I think that's a really good thing when it comes to this perspective. Most of my colleagues on FERC right now have all had state experience. And for me in particular, when I had the opportunity to go to West Virginia, I found myself, it's kind of second guessing whether I wanted to, and that surprised me a little because I always said I thought that there was so much value in the state and local experience. And then when I had the opportunity to go, I realized it sort of imbibed the federal bias that the only important work happens in DC. And I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to work in a state that I've come to love because that's not true. There's of course important work happening here, but most of the important work is happening around the country on the state and local level. And I think that perspective is really important when it comes to this partnership because I really bring from that, and I hope that I continue it throughout my tenure on FERC, a real respect for the states, not just here's my lane, here's your lane, let's stay out of each other's way because the Constitution and Congress says we have to, but really this sense of there's so much that the states do so well and better than the federal counterparts can do in a number of areas. And I think that sort of respect is really important as we are collectively working on critically important issues. So I think when it comes to this sort of cooperation, it's also not an area where we're in isolated lanes. A lot of what we're talking about today, it overlaps. We need to be talking to each other, learning from each other's perspective. I think there's a lot of room for clarity and responsibilities and roles, especially when that sort of certainty and clarity matters for a lot of the decisions that are being made right now. And a lot of those conversations happen through a good trust relationship. So I'm really encouraged by a lot of the ways that FERC is working with our state counterparts. I'm really excited about the federal-state collaborative as we continue to keep talking about gas and electric coordination issues. I think another example where we're trying to clarify, our particular roles. I can't talk about the details, of course, but as many or all of you know, we have an open docket about co-location issues in PJM. And one of the things in that public docket is talking about what's federal or jurisdiction responsibility, what's state responsibility. And I'm really interested in perspectives to make sure we get that right so that we can be doing what we need to in each of those areas and enabling each other. And I think the last thing I'd say is just I think that fundamental trust and respect is critical in order for us to be able to make progress together, being able to make sure that we're all respecting each other as a trusted partner and not just trying to make sure that we are doing what we need to in our particular lanes. There's so much overlap, which I think is a little bit counterintuitive when we talk about the need for clarity, but I think only having that trust is how we can make strides together.
Chairman?
Yes, I think Commissioner C made a number of excellent points, and I want to pick up or start where she left off around the issue of trust. And I think the trust between the states and our federal regulators has been really strong as of late, and I think it comes back to communication. There are many, many forms in which we've been able to have consistent communication with the federal regulators and provide that feedback loop, because at the end of the day, we're all working in service to the same people, the consumers and the people of either our states or the country. And so I think of two main buckets of communication that we really have with with our federal counterparts, and it's one through, of course, the formal pleading and litigation process, which I think the states have certainly become more active in, and there have been more avenues. As president of EPSA, we have been more strident in some of our positions to really let our voices be heard, right, as a state. And I think when you represent 14 different jurisdictions and you can come together with a filing that represents a cohesive point of view, it gives the FERC the confidence that this document really speaks to the wants and needs of the states. And so I think that's certainly important. But you also have several informal avenues, one of which Commissioner C talked about, which is the FERC-NARUC collaborative, But you also have the technical workshops that I think have been fabulous in really soliciting state feedback from across the nation about various issues. One coming up in June about resource adequacy. We mentioned co-location. There was one in the fall about co-location. I think these are valuable opportunities for the states to provide that feedback. So again, that the FERC can hear from the states, not just the generators in the room, but the states themselves. You also have the ability to be on panels such as this and really exchange ideas and discuss the important topics of the day. And so I agree 100% that trust is the issue, is the main thrust of this, and by virtue of us having that frequent communication, it really helps.
I think that's a great setup for the list of questions that we wanted to talk about this afternoon. So we heard from the panel before lunch about possible solutions and ways to get various technologies both on the grid, how we're going to power the AI future that we're kind of experiencing right now, but also considering cost implications from the generator side, from the data center side, and from the regulatory perspective. You all have difficult decisions to make when it comes to how we're going to approach that. In your roles now and how you're dealing with some of these questions in your various dockets that we can talk about, not the ones we can't, to be clear, we will not do any of that. What would you add to the discussion, or maybe asked differently, are there any things that you would add or you want to see as part of the discussion that would be helpful for you and your peers at the Commission to help industry move more quickly, to do it more cost effectively, and to deploy innovative technologies? Because in the end, we all want to win. So what are some of the things that we can do that would be helpful from your respective perches?
That's a great question. I think one of the things I would first highlight is thinking outside the box and thinking of innovative, perhaps one-time measures to address issues. And one thing that certainly comes to mind is two initiatives that PJM put forth recently, which is the RRI, Resource Reliability Initiative, and the Surplus Interconnection Service filing, both of which really aim at trying to address some of the issues around getting resources on grid faster. And on top of that, resources that are ready and able to be built. When you look at the PJMQ, for all that's discussed, there are over 40 gigawatts of signed ISAs of generating resources that have not been built. And I think when looking at the most recent FERC market state of the markets market report, it said that only 3.9 gigawatts were built in PJM over the last year. And that's not going to keep pace with what we need. And so I highlight that because, again, I think we have to think outside the box, and I think the RRI is an amazing example of that. I would also say that we have to make sure we're optimizing our current grid and getting everything we can out of it, right? And so that requires using existing technologies, whether it's grid-enhancing technologies, dynamic line ratings, or going to some more novel things, such as using AI to help process the queue faster. Things using the all the above approach to really addressing some of the needs. I would also say that, as a state regulator, of course, we're always concerned about cost. And I think that comes to ensuring that the markets are properly functioning and they're operating as they intend to. This isn't just a simple, basic free market. This is a market that has several rules, and we have to ensure that customers feel they're getting value from those markets. And that means making sure that the rules of the markets accurately reflect the constraints in the market and the constraints in the marketplace. And so certainly where the needs for market improvement there are, but also being sure that the right market signals are being sent to incentivize generation.
Commissioner?
Great. Well, I agree with all of that, Chairman. I think we need innovation, right? We need change. We want to see resources come and stay on the grid, and we want to do that faster. And this is all important, and trying to create the right incentives. And I agree that creative thinking and outside the box thinking is really important. And when I think about it from the perspective of our role at FERC, I'm really mindful of the fact that we are largely a reactive agency. A lot of what we do is in response to the ideas and filings that you all and other stakeholders, RTOs, generators, and all throughout the sectors bring to us. And so I love innovation. I want to see it. But in some ways, certainly we do have some proactive authority, but a lot of it is responsive to what we're seeing. And so when I think of what our role is in response to a lot of these good ideas that are coming to us, I want us to be able to encourage that. We talk a lot about the ability to bring smart people into the room and have conversations like these in formal and informal settings. I think that's critically important. And when I think of our role when it comes to approving a lot of these good ideas that are coming through, I never want FERC to be the roadblock or the ones that's unnecessarily slowing down important and needed changes. But I think that we have an important role to play as an additional layer of a deliberative check to make sure as we're moving quickly, as it's appropriate, we're also making sure we're doing that in a way that provides predictability, good rules of the road. There's through lines between the decisions, approving one decision or another. And I think it's important to have another check to make sure that we're looking at all of the players who are affected. So cost, of course, is a critically important component in all of this. What does it look like? What are the consequences here in terms of the immediate costs on ratepayers and others? And by moving quickly, are we perhaps overlooking unintended consequences where we might be creating new problems or inviting new costs further down the road? So I look at our role as helping to provide that additional level of check, but really responsive to the important changes and conversations that I think is happening throughout the industry. And I want us to be able to continue to be facilitating that and working together in that broader puzzle.
And Commissioner, I think that leads really to the next question that I wanted to ask you. You're still a relatively new commissioner, but I think at this point you qualify as a haggard veteran. You've been around enough time so that people know where to find you, and that's important. But I think people would be curious to know a little bit about your approach as cases come before you. So obviously not anything that's a pending matter, but generally speaking, how do you look at things when a 205 or a 206 is filed before the commission? What's your thought process, or what are you trying to get to when you look at the record? Because of course you can't make decisions on anything that's not in the record.
Right.
So how do you think about that? And Chairman, I'll come to you next with a similar question at the state level. Like, how do you process through some of these things? Because as industry, we want to be helpful in giving you the information you need, but we also want to make sure that we're effective and we're not just clogging up the docket and you're looking at it and saying that really wasn't very helpful. So how do you approach and think about some of those things?
Sure. No, I think it's a good question. And I'll pick up where I left off before. When I think about FERC's responsibility, I always start with, okay, well, what is our authority? What's the standard of review? And in the 205 context, there's a couple of, big picture items that I always am coming back to. And the first is this idea that we are fundamentally a reactive agency in this sense. And so we are responding to the good ideas that come. What I think is good policy matters, but to some extent it doesn't, right? To some extent, it is making sure that we are looking at the ideas that are being brought forward by others. Now, that of course does not mean that we don't have a role to play. We certainly do deny our fair share of filings that come in. But the standard we have is purposely broad. We are supposed to approve something if it is just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory or preferential. And I think there's a lot of value in that, because I think that fundamentally recognizes the idea that there's not one perfect or best solution to a lot of the issues that are facing the sector and are facing industry. And I think that's something that I really take to heart, that we want to be thoughtful and be making good and important changes, but I don't ever want us to be in a position where we're letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that that's always a reminder for me, the broad 205 standard, that there are multiple thoughtful and appropriate ways that we can be taking steps forward. In terms of how I'm reviewing and deciding whether something fits within that standard, I think about just and reasonable to who, right? Or when we're talking about being discriminatory or preferring, kind of who are the people who aren't in the room who this policy is affecting? And that's a lot of what I'm looking at there. So, looking at the ultimate effect on ratepayers, looking at long-term reliability considerations. So I think there's a lot of room there, but I think that gives us that opportunity to play a little bit more of that check to say, let's make sure that all of the interests are being represented here as we think through that. But fundamentally on the 205, I think of it as there's a lot of room to play, and I think that's important. Certainly we do have, some of that more, proactive role. You said the 206s as well, but I think the flip side of that is we first have to make a finding that something is unjust and unreasonable before FERC can come in and set a rate. And that, I think, is an appropriately high standard. So there are certainly times we need to do that, but I think that standard is a check. And that's something that I try to bring when I think about more proactive approaches that, I'm talking about with my colleagues at FERC, is there are times that we need to be moving and we need to be moving quickly. And I don't want anyone to hear otherwise. I think that's important for us to do that when it's appropriate. But there's a cost to action too, in terms of compliance, in terms of loss of regulatory certainty, in terms of the time and resources that can be tied up there as well, or loss of certainty and confidence in investments. And so I think the 206 standard is also, it's a perpetual reminder for me that when we do act, we want to make sure that it's really worth the cost. And I appreciate that's baked into the statutes that we're applying every day. So hopefully that's helpful in some sense of how I approach a lot of these issues that come in front of us.
Thank you. I think that's great. Chairman, how do you look at it from the DC perspective?
Yeah, so on the state side, of course, we don't have 205 and 206 filings, but we use certainly some of the same legal principles, and I think of terms such as used and useful, prudent, and so, almost every state regulator, they have a mission that says something about ensure safety, reliability, and affordability for their ratepayers. And I don't actually like the word ratepayers. I prefer consumers or customers, because that's more accurately reflects them. But when I get a major proceeding before me, such as a rate case, that's what I'm looking at, trying to balance that safety, affordability, and reliability. Every person takes for granted the fact that when they turn that light switch on, the lights are going to come on, and it's not an issue until that light doesn't come on. And that's when you start getting calls. And so, especially being here in the nation's capital, reliability is always front of mind. And so ensuring that our distribution grid is working as it should, it has the proper investment, but also ensuring that the average customer can then turn on those lights. And so it's always a balancing case in terms of what those investments look like. And I really look to the record for evidence around why those investments are needed. What those investments are looking to fix, what those investments are looking to upgrade, what type of resiliency do they provide, what type of redundancy do they provide, all things that are core and essential to the idea of this reliability. And then how much is it going to affect the ratepayer, not just now, but forward-looking, because in DC we do have multi-year prospective rate plans. So just certainly some of the things I look at. In DC we also have a very disparate customer base, and so some people are certainly more able to pay higher bills, and so certainly looking at how that affects the customers on all across the spectrum. So, yeah.
Chairman, at some point, I'm going to get you to use the phrase "lights on, beer cold, water warm." I will get you to use it before we're done. Okay. So, Chairman, you noted that DC, you take a look at the broad application. DC doesn't have any generation in the district yet, other than the plant that, of course, powers the Capitol. But you are very much engaged at OPSI. You have a leadership role at OPSI, which is very engaged on state-level issues that affect, as you noted, all 14 jurisdictions that are part of PJM. Talk a little bit about how you use your role as the leader of OPSI to represent the state view on jurisdictions that might be different than DC, but at the same time have a position that you're trying to coalesce around and be able to be an effective advocate for the organization.
That's a great question, Todd, because I sometimes struggle with that, because many of you know DC is a state that has some very aggressive energy goals. And again, that's not necessarily consistent across the footprint. But when I sit in the seat as president of OPSI, it's not as the chair of DC. It's as the president of OPSI representing all 14 jurisdictions. And my goal as chair of OPSI or president of OPSI is to build consensus among the states so that we can have a voice and advocate not only to PJM, but also before the FERC. And so working with the states, a lot of times it may not seem like on the surface, but there is a lot of commonality when we start talking about reliability, when we start talking about affordability and the best way to get there. And so I think what you saw is certainly around the most recent filings around the base residual auction, OPSI had a lot of comments that had a lot of consensus amongst its members, because this was something that we all understood and we could all get behind. And so, again, my goal is to build consensus. It's not necessarily to represent myself or any other one state, but build consensus where there is commonality among the states.
Can I jump in briefly on
Please.
that one? I will say OPSI and the other regional groups has been something I found really valuable in the time that I've been on FERC, because I think the state perspective is important, and they're all different. But I think I found it really fascinating in a number of those meetings, understanding what what is the process of coalescing around, OPSI's entire position, right? Because as you said, there's so much variety in the states who are represented. And some of the most interesting meetings I've had have been with some groups who have said, this may not be the best for my state, but here's why it is the position of this group here. And I think understanding that process has been really helpful for me for sharpening some of those issues. And I think it goes back to where we started with the trust and respect for the federal-state relationship there as well, because I can try to read between the lines and understanding kind of how things got there. But I've had a couple conversations that's been really helpful when we've been able to have a more frank conversation about that. So I'm so grateful for the work that you do both for DC and in OPSI as well, because I think both the state and the regional voice are different and important. And so just thank you from my perspective for the work you do.
Thank you.
Well, speaking of OPSI and the work that they do, as we see energy systems evolving, and I think we all agree they are, the rules that guide markets clearly need to evolve and keep pace with the changes that we're experiencing on the system. At the same time, we heard the earlier panel today talk about a reasonable degree of market certainty, which we can debate just what a reasonable degree of certainty is, but I think that's important for resource owners to want to make investments in the system. And that's true of our wires friends as well as the generation community. So from your seat at FERC, Commissioner, how do you think about balancing those competing interests? Because, of course, we want stability in the rules. We want to know what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to get there. But at the same time, the situation on the ground is evolving in real time in many ways, as we heard, the pace of additions to the system. So is there such a thing as a typical approach? I use my air quotes lightly.
Right.
Or are these kind of done on a one-off basis as you look at them, just because every region's a little different, but at the same time, the issues are developing some very common themes?
I think that's a really good question, and I don't think there is a typical approach. And part of the reason there is we are responding to particular filings with particular records, and as you said earlier, we have to make a decision based on what's in that record. So a lot of it is really focused on those issues, and I think that's the right way for us to be approaching the particular filings. And a lot of that is because there are through lines. There are specifics, for the particular industry, for the particular region, and it's important for us not to lose sight of those. That said, I don't think I'm doing my job well if you look at one decision and another one in a related area and can't trace the through line there, because I think being able to have that sense of predictability is important from a fundamental fairness standpoint, but also from just an ability to be able to make confident investment decisions in a changing regulatory environment. So if there's a different outcome, I would really hope that you can understand from the order what drew that difference, and if not, feel free to tell us, because we need to be doing that. But I think more generally on this issue, this is really challenging, this tension of we have to be making changes and making important decisions now. Yesterday in another context, we were talking about issues facing the hydro industry 10 years down the road, and we really made the point that 10 years starts now, and in fact, it started yesterday and years ago. So I'm really aware of that idea that we need to be moving at pace for the scope of the issues in front of us. But there's also a lot to be said for this idea of throwing unnecessary, and again, this is a really tricky term, but throwing unnecessary uncertainty isn't actually helping us along. So sometimes we need to have time for implementation, time for new rules to see how it's going to affect market participation and behavior, and to evaluate that. And so I'm always trying to remind myself that I think the tendency can be we've got a problem, we want to have solutions, but sometimes I think that the wiser course is to make sure we're taking a step back and seeing, do we need to give more time for the changes that we already have, and are too many changes in too short of time going to be counterproductive and do more harm than good? So that's how I'm looking at that. But overall, I also think that part of what our role is to do is to be reducing unnecessary barriers to competition, so that new sources, new technologies that are capable of providing important services to consumers are able to do that and to compete fairly. And market rules are squarely within our jurisdiction. So looking at what can we be doing to make sure that we're playing our role to help level that playing field, whether it's making sure that rules are appropriately evaluating sources in terms of relative reliability and cost concerns, and doing what we can to help make sure the market's sending the right signals. None of this is an answer. I think all of us are recognizing this is inherently imprecise, but this tension is always going to be there. And I think making sure that all of those factors are informing our decisions is something that I know my colleagues and I are talking about all the time, because things are moving quickly as they should.
Chairman, do you have thoughts from the state level about how you think about those same set of issues? I mean, trying to be responsive in a time of flux and market evolutions and changes where it feels like we're tinkering or tweaking, and there are those who would say it's too much, there are those who would say you're not doing fast enough, others that don't know what's happening. So how do you view it from the state commission level? And you could take that either from OPSI's perspective or from your perspective at the DC Commission, or both. I mean, that's your choice.
I'll take it from the OPSI perspective, or maybe this is the Emile perspective. But what I would say is, I think there's definitely needs to be certainty in the market, but I think there also needs to be certainty to a certain degree for consumers, right? And so, I hate to always talk about PJM, but that's just what I know. But we went through 2 or 3 years where we had some of the lowest capacity prices in history, right? And then they jumped and skyrocketed. I'm not going to say I don't have a problem if that's the case, they have to reflect the actual market principles, right? And so I think what happened this past fall, where there were a number of filings that were made to ensure that those price signals were indicative of really what the market is telling. And to me, that is very important, because if you don't have a market that's not accurately sending the right signals and is not constructed properly, then you end up with instances where customers are paying too much, where people then start to question the system. And I think getting those market rules are fundamentally necessary. That being said, I think we got a lot of great reforms through. I look forward to seeing the next auction. I think the price signals will still be there. And to take it a step back, I would note that when prices were historically low, nobody talked about these rules, right? Because prices were low. Well, that shouldn't be the way it is either, right? No matter if the rules aren't correct, the rules aren't correct. And so whether the price is low or the price is high, we need to always strive to get the price correct. Now, I certainly agree with Commissioner C that too much, too fast has a whole set of risks in and of itself. But that's, I think, one of the things that's good about our process in terms of the tariffs, and they have to go before FERC to be approved, and many people get to weigh in and interject and provide commentary to ensure that as we move through this process, we're doing so in a thoughtful manner.
I was about to offer we should get an amen when you said we should, whether they're high or low, we should be consistent with the rules. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. So I think we'll stand by that statement for sure. So I think we talked about load growth. There was some discussion on the earlier panel about what's real. I asked Commissioner Pridemore and Commissioner Rosner this morning. Like, we've seen a range of predictions. I don't know what the right number is. I know it's not 0, and I'm pretty sure it's not 10% year over year in perpetuity. But as we're thinking about that, we often hear load growth is coming and it's enormous, and we all reflexively nod along and say, of course it is. It's exponential load growth. It's pick your term. But whatever label you want to put on it, we're still learning through the process that maybe the projections aren't exactly right. And by that, I mean the efficiency of the chips that are being utilized is driving down the energy consumption for processing speed. The potential for double counting or multiple counting, I think, it's not necessarily nefarious. It's just we're trying to find the best bargain, but everyone's planning like they're going to get it. So you have a multiple that is added to whatever the total is. How do you think about the best way for us to arrive at solutions that can deliver what we are actually going to need, but is not going to result in undue burdens to consumers, or a situation where we find ourselves with a not least regrets or a no regrets, but a oh my gosh regrets outcome that none of us want to have happen? How are you thinking about that from both your seats? So Commissioner C, I'll start with you, and you can educate me a bit.
Well, I don't know about that. I think we're all facing a lot of the unknowns and the really difficult and important question when it comes to load growth forecasting. I think the first thing as I approach it is there's a lot for us to deal with here, but it's fundamentally a good problem to have, because I think whatever the amount is and where it's all going to fall out and be situated, I think we are seeing load growth, and I think that's good for the economy. I think that's good for America. So I start from that, and then what I want to know is, how certain can we get? What degree of certainty is reasonable? Because I would love to have perfect data. I think we'd all love to have perfect data. What to build where, how exactly what infrastructure we need so that we can be, as efficient as possible. Obviously, it's not possible to have that degree of certainty. So one of the things I'm interested in, I know there's discussions this afternoon more, is just how precise can we get with the information we have on what degree of confidence is reasonable as we're moving forward. That's something that I'm always is looking for. One example is, the way that it's affecting us at FERC. I certainly, again, can't talk about, pending examples, but I know, Mr. Chairman, you brought up RRI earlier, and we have a number of proposals for kind of, one-time solutions that are dealing with load growth and reliability challenges. And, one of the questions I always have is, we want to know how real is the problem, how likely is it to manifest in the way that this particular filer is telling us, because I think that helps us with our decision when we have to decide what is and isn't unduly discriminatory, how tailored the solution needs to be. And so I think that idea of what kind of certainty we can get and what we just have to live with that uncertainty is good to know. I'm also really curious as we, to kind of drill down on this discussion, just not generally about load forecast and a lot of those questions, but how much can we disaggregate with the different drivers of load growth? I think there's different questions when it comes to the AI questions, and those are different questions when it comes to reshoring of manufacturing. So I think being able to figure out how can we disaggregate this and to be able to get the certainty we can to move forward within this inherently uncertain space. So I think there's a lot for us still to learn, and I wish I had those answers. I know all of you wish we had those answers too, but I'm hopeful as well that we can learn more from the panel this afternoon and other conversations here.
Chairman, any observations?
Yeah, no, I think the load question is a great one, because last year when we talked about load, we had just started talking about data centers. It really wasn't on the radar like it is now. I think last year we were talking about reshoring, EVs, and there was a little bit of talk about data centers. Now it's been the year of the data centers, and every time you open any publication, that load forecast varies. And so I guess to answer more specifically your question about how we can do it perhaps more precisely is, I think there has to be some type of standardization to what gets qualified as a possible or an oncoming load, right? Just because you've had that, a data center has had that conversation, and I don't want to just say data center, but just anybody's had that conversation with a load serving entity or a distribution provider, doesn't mean they get added to the stack, right? Because you've had multiple conversations. Maybe it has to be some type of financial commitment, but some type of basically gating criteria, similar to the interconnection queue, right? To show that these projects are really coming so that they can be added and counted accurately, and they're not showing up in PEPCO and BGE and then in Delmarva, but they're only showing up where they're actually going to go, I think is really the only way we're going to get accurate number. And I think that's essential when we start looking at demand growth and how to build for that load and looking at the future.
I think that's a great point. So I'm down to my last question, and the audience has had the opportunity to submit some questions. I, of course, left my phone over by Travis, so I will have to go get that after I ask this question so that I can then present some, oh, thank you, Travis, so that I can present some questions to you. So on the last of my prepared remarks, thank you, Travis. The challenges and opportunities that we're facing are significant. I prefer to view it as an opportunity, because I do think there's an opportunity for the country to win, for Americans to win more broadly, for industry to win, and that's across the spectrum. I've said this at every venue I've been at in the last 6 months. There is enough in this pie to go around for T&D utilities, for generators, for customers, and for the industry that is growing and evolving. So if we think about this in a holistic way, it's a broader energy value chain. It's also pipes and gas and nuclear and all the things that kind of get mixed in. What counsel would you offer this audience and stakeholders more broadly to address the need for new generating resources? Or to be said differently, how can we pull all of the energy value chain into the discussion to have the best opportunity for a positive outcome? I know that feels a little vague, and there's a lot in there, so peel back the onion as far as you'd like, but this feels like it's a big enough issue that we need a little bit of guidance about how we can more effectively partner across the energy value chain. And Commissioner C, I'll toss it to the chairman first, as you give me the eye, that maybe I'll turn to my left and ask Emile what he thinks.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I'll start certainly with what I talked about earlier in terms of being innovative, right, and coming up with innovative solutions and fixes, especially given the timeline that we're working on, figuring out ways we can get to the grid faster. You often hear about the supply chain delays on the turbines, thus slowing down the ability to build new plants. But one of the things I was particularly encouraged about with the RRI is that you had a number of companies that said they were going to expand capacity at their existing plants, right? And so that's one way to get more instead of just starting from scratch. And that gets megawatts on the grid right away. I think looking, again, we talked about some of the technologies, but again, really challenging, and I think this is where Commissioner C talked about we're in some ways reactionary, but really challenging us as regulators in terms of thinking of new ways to do things, developing new constructs, figuring out ways to move faster than we currently are able to, especially when it comes to creating generation sources on the grid. So I think that's kind of
Great.
Yeah.
Commissioner, anything you'd add?
I think, FERC has a mission to be fuel source and technology neutral, but not reliability neutral. And I think that is true now more than ever. So I really echo this idea of innovation is important, getting more out of what we already have. Obviously there's limits to that, but I'm always excited to see proposals along those lines. And then giving us opportunities to act when it comes to, new construction, new infrastructure build. I know that's something that, we are eager to be able to review and move quickly and appropriately on at FERC. I think the idea of getting more electrons on the grid and where they need to go, that's a nonpartisan issue, and I think we've seen a lot of us coalescing around that idea of looking for good solutions and being able to move forward in an appropriate way. But I think that there's strength and diversity in the grid, there's strength and diversity of resources, and Mr. Chairman, you mentioned supply chain constraints. They affect different sources different ways. We want to make sure we have the ability to be resilient and responsive to the urgent needs we have now and that we see coming, but make sure that we have resiliency going forward as well. So I think this sense of the all of the above approach is very important, and I know that that's something that we talk about a lot about at FERC. We talk a lot with our state counterparts. We talk a lot with our industry and RTO counterparts. So I am eager for us to be able to continue acting on a lot of the opportunities, as you put it, that we all have in front of us.
All right, thank you. That was, I think, very helpful. We talked a little earlier this morning, which maybe is what triggered this question, and you probably both have some feedback on it, but what opportunities do you see for better gas-electric coordination to better handle extreme weather or peak power? And I didn't get the chance to explain to Commissioner Rosner why I smiled when he said, I've enjoyed working on it, because we've all been working on this issue for about 20 years, and I'm hopeful that we'll solve it eventually. But I'm curious if you have thoughts about ways that you see in the thinking that you've done on this. What are some ways that we can approach this that might be helpful? Because I think it was also noted there's no silver bullet.
Right.
There's maybe silver buckshot, but I'm not even sure that's right. But curious for your thoughts, and same to you, Chairman, about that.
No, I'm glad you started with your reactions to Commissioner Rosner, because that's something that has become very evident to me very early on in these conversations, is that they have been going on for a long time.
Indeed they have.
And especially because we want to be able to move quickly without unnecessary barriers. One of the things that I am finding really helpful in this conversation is seeing what's already been done and the good work that's already happened. So I am looking in particular, we talked about the collaborative with NARUC earlier, to make sure that we're able to keep the conversation going and make sure that we're not just reinventing the wheel. There is no silver bullet. I think the one thing we keep hearing from everybody is whatever the other solutions there are, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and we just need more infrastructure. So I think that's one of the main takeaways I have. I'm really looking forward to continuing that conversation and hopefully continuing to move it forward. But I think at bottom, that infrastructure piece we hear from everybody, and that's something that I think we collectively need to be moving forward on.
Chairman, anything you'd add?
Yeah, first I would say that I think, since Winter Storm Elliott, certainly in PJM, tremendous strides have been made around weatherization standards and other reforms that have really increased gas-electric coordination and gas really availability and operations during extreme weather events. Over this past winter, PJM's fleet has performed very well, and in fact, in some of the coldest times, we were still able to export electricity to other zones. So I think that's a reflection of a lot of the hard work that has gone in being really responsive to what's been going on. If there were something I think that could certainly help not only just the grid, but also some of the generators, I think it would be more coordination between the business days. I always hear about the for lack of a better term, the operating hours, right, in terms of being able to purchase gas. I think if that were to be tackled, that could certainly not only improve performance, but probably also yield some cost savings to customers as well.
You are clearly two very popular fireside chatters as my text string continues to grow. So there's one question, Commissioner C., that's directed to you that I think is particularly relevant. So this is your first chance to really visit with us. So what is happening at FERC that attendees should be involved in? Things maybe that they aren't, or things that they have been, but you'd like to see more engagement on that would be helpful for you as a decision maker?
No, I love that question. It's a really good question. I will give a plug for the Resource Adequacy Conference that we have coming up the beginning of June. I'm really excited about that. We're joking. It's like, oh my God, it's 2 full days. But 2 full days can barely scratch the surface for these issues here, and I know many of you are participating. We read those comments. When it comes to preparing for those conferences, I'm really eager for your insights and participation in that. More generally, I will say I've met with many of you. I see a lot of familiar faces. I don't think I realized how helpful it would be to be meeting with industry, meeting with the RTOs, meeting with others. Those meetings over the past 9 months I've been at the Commission have been incredibly helpful to make sure that I'm understanding the full breadth of the issues in front of us. So I guess maybe this is a plug to keep my calendar more full than I want it to, but I've really appreciated those, and please don't hesitate to tell us what we need to know in appropriate ways, because I find that really valuable.
Emphasis on appropriate ways. Yes, completely get it. Well, I see that our clock is winding down, and as we do, I want to offer you both the opportunity to share any final thoughts that you would have, any last words of guidance or advice about engagement or about matters that we should be involved in, or decisions that you're thinking about that maybe aren't even on your docket yet, but are on your mind as you think about what we're facing as we go forward. So, Chairman, I'll start with you, and then we'll finish with you, Commissioner.
All right. I guess what I would say is I think certainly engagement is very important. And I think engagement in informal channels is certainly, in some ways, not certainly, but in some ways, more important than just in the written pleadings. I think as my time as president of OPSI, I've had an opportunity to meet with a lot of the generators in this room, various members, and it's been very enlightening because as a regulator, you may have one idea of what's going on, but it's certainly very, very important for us to understand the other side of that coin, those other perspectives. And so please feel free to take advantage of the opportunity to talk with us. My doors or phone or text, it's always open. But I really do appreciate that dialogue, because I think when we have a better understanding of all the various angles, it certainly helps us form a better opinion or a better position, and also helps us be better advocates. And so that's what I would say.
Thanks, Chairman. Commissioner, what will you close us out with?
I don't know if I can really say it better than that. I think when I think about a lot of the big questions and issues that we're talking about, it really strikes me that there are so many players who are really vital to this conversation and to these decisions. And I think about it in terms of my time of joining FERC. There are 5 different commissioners, and I really see the value of 5 of different perspectives and expertise that we bring. I learn from my colleagues all the time. I also think sometimes it may be a little bit frustrating from your all perspective, having new people cycle in and out all the time who, you've got to learn different people's perspectives and also kind of bring us up to speed on issues where we don't all have individual expertise. So I would say thank you for the work that you all are doing, for those of you who have been in this for the long haul, as we all have in different ways. I really appreciate that perspective and hope we can continue that engagement on all levels, because I have a lot of confidence, and that's how we're able to make the right and best decisions moving forward.
Thank you, Commissioner C. Thank you, Chairman Thompson, for joining us. If you'll join me in thanking our panelists.